Okay, so this lecture is going to be on the Constitutional Convention. Meets in May of 1787, largely to solve the problems of the economic and political crises we talked about last time. This is Madison's meeting that he got permission from the Confederate Congress to create, and he will eventually be the major leader of the meeting. So the background should be pretty clear. The economic and political crisis we already talked about. Collapse of trade, debts, the inability of the states to pay back their debts, insolvency, bankruptcy, the problem with the British and the forts, the Spanish down in southern Mississippi, just on and on and on. So there are several major debates that occur in the Constitutional Convention, and one way of looking at this is to try to understand that these guys understood that they're creating a whole new government. And most of them understand it when they arrive, and it's not much of a kind of shock to them. So they understand they're creating something new, and they are really obsessed with balancing and splitting power. They don't want any one part of the government to become more powerful than the others, because when one gets more powerful, one can eventually dominate and form a new tyranny. So much of these negotiations are just very slight alterations to ideas. So it's going to be, again, pretty detailed, but by the end of this, and you should have a pretty good understanding of what they talked about in there. Background is pretty clear. This is what, again, the United States looks like. About 1783, land all the way to the Mississippi and up to the Canadian border, the British colony in Canada. The land west from the Appalachian Mountains was, in some instances, claimed by individual states, but they weren't really running those areas. So those are basically open land, and that's what the stuff like the Land Ordinance Act was going after. So that's what the United States looks like. To go through some of the major leaders that will emerge within the debates of the Constitutional Convention, number one is really George Washington. He was overwhelmingly recognized, even in his own lifetime by the late 80s, as the kind of father of the country. The one who had fought to the bitter end in the Revolutionary War, the never say die kind of guy, and say never surrender, never give up. So he was the major kind of personal symbol of American power and independence and strength. He had retired from the Army in 1783 when the peace treaty was signed, and said he wanted to go back home to his land in Virginia and basically live out the rest of his life in peace and quiet. So he's probably the most famous living American at that point in time. And Madison and others were very desperate to get Washington to join this meeting because of the great symbolism that Washington brought for honesty, virtue, and strength. Fairness. Washington was back and forth for a little while about whether or not he should join the convention. And from the scholarship we have on the letters he wrote to his friends and whatnot, he seems to have been convinced by the argument that if he didn't join the convention and this convention became important, that the memory of him would be tarnished. That his own personal legacy in the United States would have that kind of black eye at the end of his career. Where if he refuses to take part, that he will have abandoned democracy. Or, in the way he wrote it in the letters, a dereliction to republicanism, if he refused to join the meeting and support a stronger government. So it'd be like Washington went AWOL for the last part of his life. And Washington was always very aware of his role in history and that he would be a remembered person. He was always very aware of his public image and obsessed with keeping it as fair and benevolent as possible. He wants the American people to remember him as one of the great founders and the father of the country. So he is very personally aware of his own historical reputation going forward. That's something to always remember when he becomes eventually the first president under the Constitution. But there's other guys. Franklin, we've already talked about at length. He lived in Philadelphia. He was a printer. That was his business. He was also a lead scientist in the mid-1700s, first famous American with the electricity experiments, and he had also gotten involved in the Revolution. He was the theoretical chairman of the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson largely wrote it, but largely John Adams and Benjamin Franklin are the big editors of the first draft. And Franklin went on to be minister to France, so head diplomat to France, and largely responsible for getting the French to join the war against the British. John Dickinson is also from Pennsylvania. He's also a large landowner. He wrote the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, so he was directly involved in the Revolution. Also, he had been the president of Pennsylvania, and I believe also Delaware. So he was a leader at the state level also, and he was seen as a legal scholar. James Madison is from Virginia. He had just graduated college, basically, when the Revolution gets kick-started. So he was one of the youngest guys. He is seen as a political science genius. He went to, I believe it was Princeton, and finished his entire degree in like 3 years. So taking advanced courses at Princeton. So he was seen as, and he was largely allowed to write his own curriculum, take whatever classes he wanted. So he's seen as a very powerful intellect, even from a very early age, from about age 20 or so. And he is one of the younger generation that will be one of the major leaders of the United States for the next several decades. And Madison had been involved with the Confederate Congress in the 1780s, realized how bad it was functioning. He was one of the lead people putting out public calls for the Articles to be amended and strengthened, or the national government to be strengthened to deal with the problems. Hamilton is from New York City, or he lives in New York City. He's actually from one of the Caribbean islands. He is seen as an economic genius, a person who understood economics at a very kind of business basic level, and understood the power of governments are largely tied with economic strength. So he's a lawyer in New York City. Again, he had been involved with the Confederate Congress, had quit in disgust pretty quickly, and had spent most of the 1780s publicly, like Madison, calling for a strengthening of the national government. James Wilson is from Pennsylvania. He was also seen as a great legal scholar. And he was a member of the Confederacy, the Confederate Congress, for many years in the 1780s, and seen as one of the national leaders. So he's another famous kind of scholarly type person who has a lot of direct experience in the malfunctions of the Congress. Moving on. Roger Sherman is from Connecticut. He was seen as an intellectual regarding politics and religion especially. He was a professor of religion at Yale at the same time. He had become mayor of New Haven, which is a city where Yale is, even today. So he was involved in a lot of state-level politics in Connecticut and kind of defined as a rising political star. Edmund Randolph is from Virginia, had been involved in Virginia state-level politics. And Randolph will become important because Madison has a large plan for what he wants to do in Philadelphia. But Madison is he's a quiet kind of guy. He's one of those who comes up with the overall theory, but he doesn't really speak in public very well. He's short, he's quiet, he's one of those who likes to sit in the back, writes long essays, and has brilliant long-term theories about politics, but doesn't want to give the speeches himself. So Madison will often give the speeches and the ideas to Randolph to present to the overall convention. So Randolph ends up speaking a whole lot. And when the convention meets in May of 87, almost to a man, they understand that they're not just changing the articles, they're not just tweaking them, they're going to trash them. So in theory, this is a revolution. They're ending one government and building another. And they know it. There's not much mystery about that going on, especially after the first couple days of the meetings. So to a man, almost every single one understands that they are creating a whole new government. So in theory, this is a bloodless revolution. They're overthrowing the Confederacy and creating the Constitution. The first vote is taken to basically make Washington the head judge of the convention, the president of the convention. So Washington will not talk very much at all. He doesn't give big speeches. He's the one who kind of sits up on the high chair and keeps order in the convention. And this thing gets pretty brutal. If any of you have ever been to Philadelphia in the summertime, the heat and the humidity are just awful. When they meet, they also agree to do their meetings and their debates in secret. They do not want the public knowing what they are talking about. They say if the public is keeping track with every little debate, then that will inhibit the guys in the convention from giving their full kind of honest interpretation of what should be done. Because the people could get mad. So they say no interviews with newspapers. No one's allowed to keep a diary of what is said. They lock the doors. They bring shades down on the windows. And they run the convention inside nearly by candlelight in a lot of ways. So they are isolating themselves from public debate. They're going to have their meeting. They're going to make the decisions in that room. And at the end of it, they will present what they did to the public. But they don't want the public following it on a day-to-day basis. So, again, if you've ever been to Philadelphia and have experienced that heat and humidity, imagine locking yourself in a room with burning candles for 10 or 12 hours a day, all day with no ventilation. This is a miserable place to be. And these guys get angry with each other. They get frustrated because a lot of them are not willing to compromise. A lot of them have their kind of ideologies that they don't want to see changed. They all have their visions about what the United States should be. And the arguments go on for months. So inside, it gets pretty brutal. Literally, physically, these guys are sitting close to each other. They don't have modern deodorant or anything like that. This becomes a pretty nasty place to be, politically and just physically in that space for so long. So questions about any of this so far? Yeah.
How many days does it take?
How many days? It starts in May, about, I think, the second week of May, 87. It goes through till September. September 17th, I think, is the last day. So, 4 solid months. Every day. And some of them got so pissed off at this, they left and went home. Okay. The first big argument when they start debating what the new government should look like is over the executive power. They go back to John Locke. Almost all of them have read John Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau. They've read these political ideas coming out of the Enlightenment. And they understood that the problem of the executive power in a government is the fact that the executive could consolidate power, take control of the army, and create a tyranny, create a dictatorship. So they're very worried about executive power also because they just rebelled against the king. And that was a miserable experience for almost all Americans. So they're very careful and afraid of putting too much power, especially in the executive branch of government. And the first debate is, do you want to have one single person be the executive, the head of the executive branch, or do you want to break it up amongst a commission or a committee? So do you want to have one president or 5? Or 7 or 9? Or who knows what number? James Wilson eventually gives the argument, and this will convince the rest of the convention, that, look, we have 13 states. These states have been in existence, theoretically at least, since 1776. So we've had 11 years of experience with governors, and sometimes a state will call their executive a president. So we have 13 experiments in a single person being the executive. And none of them have yet turned themselves into kings. So that seems to be good evidence that we can have one person leading the executive branch without them moving to create a tyranny and make themselves into a kind of new king of the United States. And that seems to convince the rest of the convention to make the executive power vest that in one elected person. How do you elect that person is thrown up into the next debate. So that debate didn't last very long. That one was fairly easily solved. The next debate is the big one. This is the idea of representation. They're going to build a Congress, and they know it. They want to build a national legislature that will be powerful, have the power to declare war, have the power to raise taxes, collect taxes, spend money, create budgets, all that kind of stuff. This is going to be a powerful government. Far more powerful than the Articles, the Confederate Congress. Crap. Okay, so Madison showed up, and he knew, and many people knew, that representation. How do you determine who gets into that national government? How many members will it have? Will there be a split between different groups? All that kind of stuff. That is going to be the big debate. So Madison actually shows up to Philadelphia with a plan in hand. And he was from Virginia, so he kind of talked with his friends from Virginia about what he wants to do, and they largely agreed. So this becomes known as the Virginia Plan, and it is presented by Randolph. Randolph presents it, but Madison basically came up with it. So number one, a centralized government run by a national legislature. Madison wants Congress to be by far the most powerful branch of the national government. He wants two houses. He wants two different groups of Congress. A lower house chosen directly by the people of the country, and an upper house chosen by the state legislators, which means your government in Sacramento, or in Boston or something like that, will determine who eventually that becomes the Senate, who will be your U.S. Senator. So he proposes that the average citizens get to vote for their members in the lower house, but not the upper house. That gets kicked up to the state level governments. The Virginia Plan said that the legislature, these two houses of Congress, should choose the executive. They would elect the president. And also the legislature would choose the judiciary, the court system, and the Supreme Court, what eventually becomes known as the Supreme Court. So this is a very powerful, this is the center of politics in the country under his plan. They determine largely everything else. And third, he says the legislature can make laws where the individual states seems incompetent, where especially with tariffs, where they were fighting against each other so much that things had devolved into a kind of level of bankruptcy and anarchy, and void state laws that went against the national laws. So this Congress is going to meet, they're going to start passing laws. If they pass a law that kind of infringes on a state law, the state law is wiped out, according to his plan, the Virginia Plan. So this is a hugely powerful national legislature. And this is controversial for a lot of people. So, questions about the Virginia Plan at all? Nope. Moving on. No answer. One person says yes. Do you agree? I guess one person carries it. Okay. So the Virginia Plan says, in another aspect, if this national legislature is going to be overwhelmingly powerful over the individual states, then the big question is, how do you determine who gets into the national legislature, and how many representatives does each state have in the legislature? The Virginia Plan said both houses of Congress, the lower house and the upper house, should have their house built up from individual states, the collection of the states, and the most populated state, the state with the most people, would get the most members in both houses of Congress. Is that what we have today? Are you alive? I'm on the verge of puking and I can keep up. Come on. Do we have this today? Anybody know? No, we don't. The upper house today has 2 senators from every state, regardless of population. So Madison's idea is pretty drastically different from what we eventually get. So there are some negotiations that are going to go on. The problem with Madison's theory about representation, how do you determine how many representatives each state gets? He wanted to do it completely based on population. Why? Because he's from Virginia, one of the biggest populated states in the whole country. Therefore, by default, Virginia would get more members into Congress. And therefore, Virginia would have more kind of voting clout in Congress than smaller states like Delaware, who have small territories and small populations. The problem with this is that the Continental Congress, the Confederate Congress under the Articles of Confederation, already operated under state equality. So no matter how many people live in Virginia and Delaware, in the National Congress that already existed in the 1780s, those two states had an equal amount of representatives in the national legislature. Does that make sense? So the major question with representation in the Virginia plan is, do you want to change the system that exists? Madison did. He wants to base it on population. Other states want to keep the status quo, keep things the way they are. Because especially smaller states that have small populations fear that if you base how many members each state gets in Congress on that state's population, then the smaller states like Delaware or Vermont that have small populations, Virginia will get maybe 30 members in Congress and Delaware will get 1 or 2. So the small states start complaining very quickly that this is going to hurt their voting clout in the national government. And because this is a very powerful national government, and especially the legislature, a lot of power hinges on this question. Will you base this thing on state equality or population? And this debate goes on for weeks. This is the big sticking point. And it's about 6 weeks or so of constant bickering. 10 hours a day. Virtually every day of the week. Week after week after week. And they cannot agree on what to do about the idea of representation. So the small states fear that their voting clout will be basically annihilated if Madison's Virginia plan goes through. If the membership in Congress is based on the population of individual states. And the small states will start ganging up to basically defend themselves politically. So does all this make sense? It's the fundamental question of the convention. And it goes on and on and on and on. Perfect clarity. You don't have any questions about this at all? Yeah.
So was it a debate, was half of them wanting it and the other half not, or was it just...
It's not exactly half and half, but whenever they take a vote, they can't get a majority either way to support either opinion. So a lot of people just refuse to vote, and it just goes on and on. So it's a major problem that's not getting solved. And the guys are getting frustrated. And, they're getting hot and sweaty, so they're getting pretty angry at this fast, especially as July starts to creep in. The small states band together and present what they call the New Jersey plan. And you can remember this because the Virginia plan is the big population state, right? New Jersey, much smaller territory, much smaller population. So they present an alternative. They say they want the National Congress to only be one group, one house, one national legislature that will be based entirely on state equality. And they agree that the legislature should be given the powers of taxation and to regulate trade for all the states. So they agree with Madison that it has to be a very powerful government. They have to have the power of taxation. And they have to be able to tell the states what to do to a certain extent. But they do not agree on how do you compose Congress. How do you decide, number one, how many groups there will be, one house or two houses? or how you determine how many people get into Congress from each state. Another thing they do is they take a different stance. They say they want a plural executive, which means several people that will be appointed to the executive branch to run it. And they want the executive branch to appoint the Supreme Court, and that the national government, specifically the executive, would be empowered to force the states to adhere to the national laws. So that's the small state plan. And it largely hinges on the representation question. They want state equality in the legislature. So they're tweaking Madison's plan for what they think, in their own mind, is fairness, but in a lot of reality, they're trying to keep power in their own position. And the argument goes on and on and on and on. So, moving forward again. Yep. Okay. Wilson gives a speech saying that the national legislature should be divided between two houses, two different groups, an upper house and a lower house, because you don't want to just give all this power to just one group, because they can, if you just let them vote by a majority, they can very quickly start passing pretty radical laws. So he wants something to balance and to kind of slow down the lawmaking power of Congress. So he says the best way to do that is to break them into two different groups, two different houses, so that if the one house passes some radical stuff, there is a kind of break, like a brake on a car, something to slow them down. And that is the other house that theoretically would be able to rise up and not pass that law, which means the law would not go into effect. And many of the founders, the people who write this stuff and go into the first governments, they refer this as a check on government power. And when they use that term, you don't think about the checks you take out and write. Think of it in terms of hockey. When someone is moving forward and you want to stop him, you hit him hard and you stop him in his tracks. A hockey check. So they're literally saying, stop him right in his tracks. That is what they say is a check on power. So that's Wilson's argument, and he largely convinces the rest of the convention that a one-house legislature is a bad idea because they can get out of hand quickly because there's not much to stop them. And that will eventually become true in the French Revolution when they create one house and they start voting to kill each other. Madison says that his great fear of a one-house legislature based on state equality is that the large population states will be overwhelmed by the small population states. And he largely looks west. He says there's a lot of open territory out there that we haven't made into states beyond the mountain range. And when their populations grow and they start applying for statehood, they will at first have small populations. And if you start carving out another 10, 20 states out of that large western territory, and they all have small populations, they can all get together and vote with New Jersey, Delaware, Vermont, all the small states, to determine national policy. So that's his defense of representation based in state population. He says if you have equal state equality in Congress, then the small states that maybe have like 25% of the actual population, they will have the majority vote in Congress, and therefore, he says, you will get a tyranny of the minority, the population minority, against the majority. And that seems to convince a whole lot of people in the convention also. So the debate goes, again, on and on and on and on. Roger Sherman from Connecticut sees an easy compromise. He says, okay, we basically agree we're going to have two houses in Congress. Why not make one of them based on state population, the other based on state equality? Simple. And he proposes that, and it's not acceptable to either side, so virtually everyone votes against it. So he threw his hands up in the air and said, what else do you want? So largely, especially the large states, rejected this because they wanted to keep power in their own position. So a whole lot of other compromises are sought. His is probably the most logical, the easiest. A lot of other compromises are proposed, and one by one they are all shot down by votes. So again, for weeks and weeks, representation is the argument of the convention. It is the one speed bump, the one major stumbling block that will convince many of them that this stuff may be impossible. If they don't agree, then the whole convention may just fall apart. People may get frustrated and go home, and then you're just going to be left with a weak national government that already existed. So by early going into mid-July, a lot of the guys at the convention start saying, we need a compromise, we need a deal that will be acceptable to at least a majority of the people voting in the convention. We have to pass something, because if we don't, this is going to drag on and on and on, and people are going to go home, and the convention will collapse. So they appoint a committee to study the problem and to propose a solution. The small states are angry at this stuff, and they say that the large states are trying to, create a tyranny. The large states, they say one group accuses the other of refusing to compromise, refusing to negotiate. So again, this goes on and on and on. And many of the small states start saying that maybe they'll just walk out and end the convention that way. So the convention, the leaders of it and the members of it start fearing that this thing is going to fall apart. So they appoint a committee to create some kind of deal that could make enough people happy to actually get passage. They call this the Grand Committee. The committee meets. I think Benjamin Franklin is probably the most recognizable and powerful person in that committee. And they eventually propose what becomes known as the Great Compromise. And this is one of the most famous pieces of politicking and legislation ever created, in U.S. history at least. So the Great Compromise is, they propose, the national legislature is two houses, a lower house and an upper house. And in the document they call it bicameral, which means two houses, literally. The lower house will be based on population size. One representative in the lower house for every 40,000 people, which eventually gets tweaked a little bit later on. That raises a new question. Especially southern states have a whole lot of slaves that the southern governments do not recognize as official people with rights. But a lot of the southerners, especially in Virginia, say we want to count our slaves as actual living people in our state to get more representatives in Congress for our state. And the small states say, what the hell? That is an obvious attempt to just increase your population to get more political power in Congress. And the small states refused. So eventually, the compromise proposed by the committee is that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for population counting to determine how many representatives a state gets in what becomes the lower house, the House of Representatives. Another proposal, finance bills, government spending laws. Government budgets have to be created and passed by the lower house first. They wanted to locate the ability to spend money closer with the individual person, because the individual person will eventually be voting for their member in the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives, to this day, legally is the first group that is supposed to pass the U.S. budget and spending laws in general. Does that happen today? Yes, but barely. What we have today is basically the president comes out with their budget proposal first to try to get favorable terms of debate, to try to set the stage for what the president wants. And then the lower house, the House of Representatives, goes and starts negotiating with the president. Things go back and forth, and U.S. senators today are heavily involved in that debate. So usually what you get today is the lower house will vote on a money bill at like exactly noon, 12, and then the Senate will vote on the exact same legislation like 5 minutes later. So theoretically they're still doing it, but in reality the negotiations involve senators and the president also. And the final proposal is obviously state equality in the upper house. So they take Sherman's idea and they add on this other stuff, but that's largely the compromise. 2 houses, the lower one on population, the upper one based on state equality. So eventually every state will get 2 senators, 2 members of the upper house. This comes down to a vote in the convention itself in general. And it barely passes. The small states obviously vote for it. They get a couple of fairly larger states, like North Carolina, to support it. And they get half the delegates from Massachusetts to support it. And the interesting thing is they get a very slight majority of the vote because 2 of the guys who came from New York had actually gone home already. The governor of New York told them to leave the convention and go back home. So there's 1 guy from New York, and that's Hamilton, and he votes in favor of this. So they barely cobble together a majority to get this thing accepted and move on to the next ideas that they have to debate. So it's a very, very, very close thing. Moving on to the next debate. Now, you don't have to remember which states and all that kind of stuff, but that's fine. But that's just to show you physically how close this thing was. And this is after 6 or 7 weeks of constant rankling about this stuff, constant argument. So questions about the idea of representation or the debate on it, where this is going or what they eventually do? Nope. Okay. And that's largely what we have today. The House of Representatives is chosen by the population, based on population. And for the first 120 years or so of the United States, the Constitution said that the upper house is based on state equality and chosen by the state legislatures. So the average person did not get to vote for the U.S. Senator until the early 1900s. So well beyond after our semester's over. Okay. Now they have a very powerful national Congress. They know what it's going to look like, where the representatives are going to come from. And the next day, the next debate is who's going to choose the executive? Who's going to choose the president? The convention overall votes to allow Congress to choose the president. So the average people will not vote for Congress either. Madison in particular did not like that. He said that if the president is chosen by Congress, then the president going into office will owe Congress favors because they voted for him. He owes his power to Congress, his position. So Madison becomes afraid that the executive will be eventually overpowered by Congress, will be pushed around by Congress. So Madison wants to give the president the ability to revise laws that Congress passed. So if a proposed law comes to the president's desk, theoretically he can cross stuff out and rewrite stuff just personally. And if he signs it at the bottom, his changes become law. And this is a big debate over the past 20 years or so with what we today call the line item veto, where the president doesn't have to veto the whole thing, he can just cross certain pieces of it out and then sign it and it passes. So this is a new debate that pops up. How much power should the president have over legislation? Should he just have a straight veto power? He has to get rid of the whole thing, reject the whole thing, or can he reject parts of it? Can he change it? That's one of the next big debates. They eventually decide to not give the president that power. So eventually the president will have the power to either reject it all or accept it all. One or the other. Madison argued also who was going to choose the president. Again, he didn't want Congress dominating the presidency. But Madison also did not trust the average person to vote for president. So he says he wants to take the power to choose the president out of Congress, but he doesn't trust the people enough. Why do you think that is? Yeah, they don't know enough. They're not smart enough to be given the responsibility of choosing the President of the United States. It is too powerful a position to give to what he will call the ignorant and meddlesome masses. So Madison is very much an elitist. He believes in what he calls the wealth of the nation, the highest educated, the rich, that they should be empowered to basically run the government and take care of all the poor and working class people out there. That those poor and working class people are not intelligent or educated enough to make good choices in a democracy. So he doesn't trust the people. And a lot of people at this convention, a lot of guys do not trust the people. So they set up a system of what we today call electors, where basically, if you're sitting here in like Fontana or Rancho Cucamonga, if you have a large population, you choose the smartest person from your community to go off to the national capital and cast the community's vote for president. So again, he's trying to locate power in the educated elite, because he does not trust the average person. And that system goes on for quite a long time. The Electoral College, if you pay attention to the campaigns and the debates and whatnot going on today, it's largely focused on which candidate will win only like 5 or 6 different states, right? Because you only have to win 7 states to become president. So theoretically, you only need 7 more votes. If you get 1 more vote than your opponent in 7 different states, then you become president. That's the way the system works today. And today there's a lot of calls to change that somehow. So Madison and Franklin say that the common people are smart enough, and they prove their loyalty to their communities and to the government in their sacrifices during the Revolution. Madison also argued that a lot of these working class people are poor. And if you give them the vote for president, rich people may come through and bribe the poor. Say, if you vote for the guy I want for president, I'll give you $100. So Madison doesn't trust the people intellectually or economically. And he wants to separate the people from the choice of president. Franklin especially argues that the common people have proven their virtue in fighting against the British and fighting against tyranny, but largely Madison and others still don't trust the people actually to be smart enough to do this. But they were very afraid that if they completely alienate or disassociate the vote for president from the people, that the people will not accept the Constitution. The people want some kind of voice. So the compromise they create is eventually what we call today the electoral system. The president will be chosen by individuals from communities, and the communities get to choose who that kind of flag bearer is for their group. And usually, hopefully they would vote for like a doctor, a lawyer, or someone who's an expert in politics and actually keeps up with this stuff. They don't want the so-called rabble voting for president. Again, they give this to a committee. The committee recommends the electoral system, that the president should have a term of office of 4 years and be eligible, be allowed to run for re-election. In the original Constitution, they do not give any limit to how many terms a president can serve. And that doesn't go in until the 1940s. So for a long time, it is possible legally for the president to run for re-election over and over and over and over again. Does anyone know what the limit is today? 2 terms. You win 2 elections for president, you cannot run again under the Constitution. And if no presidential candidate gets a majority of these electors, these people sent from the communities, then the U.S. Senate, the upper house, will choose the president of the United States. So those are the recommendations. Most of this goes into law and becomes part of the Constitution. But you can see, again, the balancing act that they're trying to do. They don't want to give the Congress too much power. They don't want to give the average people too much power. They don't want to give the President or the Senate too much power. And it just goes on and on. It's a very delicate balancing act. And that is another reason why the convention just didn't end in July when they finished the representative vote, the representation debate. They still meet for another 2 months because they have to hash out some other things. And they're very aware that if you're going to build a powerful government, you have to make sure that one group cannot dominate the rest, or one office cannot dominate the rest. So, questions about the Electoral College at all? Does anyone know how the Electoral College actually functions today? Today, say in California, on election day, or hopefully a lot of Californians go and actually vote. Whichever candidate gets a majority in the state of the so-called popular vote, the vote of the people, then that candidate gets all the electors from California. And California used to be the biggest population state. So California used to have the biggest poll in the presidential election. Does anyone know what state it is now? Texas. That was just changed in the past 2 years when the U.S. Census in 2010 was done. And Texas now has a larger population than California. Does anyone know the states you have to win to become president? At minimum, 7 or 8 states? It's the biggest population one, so you get Texas, California. What are the other ones you constantly hear about in the presidential election? Florida. New York. That one usually goes Democratic, so they just kind of say that the Democratic Party will win it by default. So they don't really talk about New York much. Just like they don't talk about California much, or Texas. Any others? New Hampshire is too small, but they have a big kind of pull in the primaries because they're the first ones to vote in the primaries. So that's why they're famous. Any others? Ohio. Pennsylvania. And these where the big cities are, right? And to a lesser degree, Illinois, because of Chicago. And Chicago is, I think, like the 4th largest city in the country. And Arizona was rising until Phoenix basically entirely went into foreclosure. But Phoenix is, I think it's the 3rd largest city now. Just overtook Chicago a couple years ago. But if you watch the presidential debates and the news coverage, they're always talking about the states that tend to go back and forth, the big ones. Ohio, Florida, Illinois. And this year, apparently, the past couple of years, apparently Virginia. And if you notice, that's where the major parties also put their conventions, right? Florida, this year North Carolina, because that one seems to be going back and forth. Okay, so in the Intricate Balancing Act, now many in the convention start getting afraid that the Senate is going to become too powerful because if the Electoral College can't choose the president, then, and largely back then, you had many people running for president, just like you do today. So if you have 4 or 5 different candidates, it's up in the air whether or not one of them will actually get 51% of the electoral vote. So it seems likely in the early years that the Senate will choose the president fairly consistently. And at this point, a lot in the convention start fearing that the Senate is becoming too powerful, so they start cutting its powers. Number one, the Senate in their earlier drafts was responsible for diplomacy. They were creating treaties. They were signing treaties with foreign powers. They take that away from the Senate, give it to the president. The Senate also used to have the power of appointing foreign ambassadors. They take that away, give it to the president, and deciding who goes into the Supreme Court and the federal court system on down. And with the Supreme Court, the nominating power goes to the president, and the Senate keeps the power to approve who goes into the courts. There was a big debate over whether the Senate should be given the money power, and eventually they decide to give it back to the House. And the Senate is only given permission to accept the law that the House had passed. The Senate cannot come up with its own budget. Theoretically. They tend to do it all the time right now. Or they don't pass it, they negotiate. And they propose, but they never actually vote on it until the House does something. So they are legally within the Constitution still, but those limits, those lines are getting blurred pretty constantly, especially in the budget debates. And they take the power, of choosing the president when the Electoral College fails, and they give it over to the House. Because they feared that if the states are choosing the U.S. senators, then that is too much power located in the rich. So today, under the Constitution, if a presidential candidate, if no candidate gets a majority of the Electoral College, the House of Representatives has a vote. And whoever they choose becomes president in the next term. Or continues as president or whatever. And when you have dominant political parties, I mean, obviously, if neither, this year, if neither Obama nor Romney in 2012 get the majority of the electoral vote, and the vote goes to the House of Representatives, who has a majority in the House? The Republicans. Are they likely to choose Obama to be the next president? Absolutely not. But it's a possibility. And the Senate is given the power when, at first, usually under the first draft of the Constitution that's eventually accepted and passed, you had a bunch of guys running for president. Whoever got the majority became president. Whoever got second most became vice president. Right? Does that make sense? Consolation prize. Under the original Constitution, the Senate, if no candidate gets a majority, the House chooses the president and the Senate would choose the vice president. So again, you see a very delicate balancing act going on. And now another big debate rises once they finish the debates and they create the system for choosing the president and how much power the president will have. The next big debate is on slavery. And it appears they really pushed this one off to the very end because no one wanted to bring it up. The southern states have huge amounts of slaves. By the 1800s, about a third of their populations are slaves. This is a massive amount of people. What is the Constitution going to do about the idea of slavery? A leader from South Carolina comes forward, his name's Pinckney, and he gives a speech where he literally says, no southern state will accept the Constitution unless you guarantee the survival of slavery. So in the original Constitution, the word slavery is never mentioned because it's very controversial, even back then. A lot of Northerners hated slavery. They viewed it as immoral, inhumane, and economically dangerous. So there's, again, already this rift building between Northerners and Southerners about should slavery be extended, how should it be guaranteed, or should it just be gotten rid of in the Constitution. So in the Constitution, in Article 1, it talks about, in very vague terms, what we know they're talking about, slaves. But they say that Congress will not have the power to prohibit the importation of certain persons for 20 years. Which means in the original Constitution, it says Congress will not have the power to outlaw the importation of new slaves until 1807. Why 20 years, do you think? You know, these guys are in 1787. Why did they choose 20 years? Because it's a compromise. They realized in their own time that this is such a divisive issue that this could kill the whole Constitutional Convention and all the work they had done could collapse. So they literally decided to pass this off on the next generation of politicians. Most of these guys are in their 50s, maybe 60s at this point. They're not going to live another 20 years for the most part. And even if they're alive, they're probably not going to be in office to be given the power to end the importation of new slaves. So they literally passed this one off on the next generation. You guys solve it. And a lot of members in the convention are absolutely livid that this has happened. Many, especially the Northerners, are repulsed by slavery. They hate it. They view Southern slave owners as petty kings and tyrants over literally an enslaved population. So they say we cannot talk about freedom and democracy and equality when you put slavery into the original document also. That is a hypocrisy. the Southerners defined their slaves as property. And that even enraged the Northerners, who said, why are you putting in the Constitution the explicit protection of one kind of property and not talking about any other kind of property? That's unfair also on that level. So a lot of people say that this is kind of deal with the devil. This is the deal they make to keep the group together to eventually finish the Constitution. Because the Southerners said, if you don't protect slavery, then we're walking. And a ton of Northerners did not like it. Madison himself is a Virginian, so a lot of his friends are slave owners. He was apparently a slave owner even himself. And he apparently, much like Jefferson, owned slaves but didn't like the system very much, which is a hypocrisy in itself. But Madison predicted that the Southerners will come up with a list of reasons why they have to keep slavery forever in the next 20 years, so that eventually when the 20 years pass and Congress has the power to outlaw the importation of new slaves, that the Southerners will come up with this long list of reasons why they need slavery, basically. So he says it's giving them a 20-year head start to start thinking about how to defend slavery. And remember, this 20-year period, in 1807, Congress is not given the power to outlaw slavery, right? There's no mention of what Congress's powers are after that. It's just the power to end the importation of new slaves from outside the country. And there's a prediction that eventually, within 20 years, the Southerners will have enough slaves and they won't have to import any new ones. So again, this is an excuse to basically keep it around and avoid the debate. So Madison appears to have been revulsed personally by slavery and by the protection of slavery in the Constitution. But he says that this is something that had to be given into. He says the greatest threat to the American people is disunity, dismemberment, and that you have to make these deals sometimes to get the larger system that you want. You give in on a little piece and you get the rest. It's a basic deal. And of course, the people enslaved wouldn't think that this is a little piece, and a lot of Northerners didn't think this was a little piece. They're very angry about it, so the debate over slavery rages on, even though the system is kept in place for quite a long time. So, by about September, most of the major debates are over. They are writing the actual document, and they finish the Constitution in September. Most of the delegates actually signed the thing. Not all of them. Some of them went home, like those two guys from New York. They went home, they never signed it. So Washington takes it as the official kind of last signature. He puts his stamp of approval on the thing and sends it to the Continental Congress to begin the ratification process. In the Constitution, I think it's Article 4 or 5, one of those. It says that you need 9 states to accept it, to ratify the Constitution, and then the new national government goes into effect. So they're looking to get 9 states, 9 out of the 13, to vote yes. They don't have any recommendations about how that vote should happen. The Continental Congress will not take any recommendations. They will basically just be a messenger. They'll pass it on to the state leaders and governors in the 13 states and say, make a vote on this somehow. Some states will have a popular vote where the average people can vote on it. Some states will have a vote in the state legislature. Like Massachusetts will say that's good enough. So each state will determine their own individual ratification process. And the debate over ratification is the next step. So this thing is finished in autumn of 1787. It is publicized for the first time. People read it. It's published in newspapers. I mean, most of the common people that knew how to read this thing, and they start debating on it publicly. And this goes on for weeks. There is an anti-Constitution movement that rises in the country. A lot of people did not want to accept the Constitution because they thought it was dangerous in one way or another. Their number one complaint is that there is no Bill of Rights. What we today think of as the Bill of Rights. The original document was just a list of the different branches of government, how you choose the members in Congress or the president, and they're kind of basic operating rules. The original document did not give any freedom of speech or freedom of religion or anything like that, freedom of the press. So the so-called derisive term are anti-federalists. The Federalists are the people who want a stronger national government. So these guys become like the opposition movement. So their number one complaint, there is no guarantee of civil rights to the people of the country in this document. A lot of the Federalists said, well, we don't really have to write it into the Constitution because the individual states had already done that, right? The state constitutions had already had all those guarantees of individual rights. That wasn't convincing many people. Did not even convince Thomas Jefferson, who was in France at this point. Reads the draft of the Constitution and writes letters back to the United States saying, do not accept this. This is dangerous. If you don't have any guarantee of your rights, you are making a deal that you don't know what the result's going to be. So Jefferson at first does not want the Constitution. And he is not convinced to accept it until Madison and his other friends from Virginia say, the very first thing we are going to do when Congress comes into effect under the Constitution, we will write up a series of rights, inalienable rights that the government can supposedly never take away. But, we live in a different world today, right? So Jefferson is eventually convinced because they tell him the very first laws we're going to pass are going to be amendments to the Constitution, changes. And it will be a list of rights that the people and the states retain. Number two, the Anti-Federalists bring out the old Montesquieu argument. A republic cannot get too large. Because a large territory is ungovernable by an elite group in one city. A large national government invites tyranny. Because if the people in that capital city cannot rule effectively or pass laws and enforce them effectively for the kind of far-off frontiers, then that invites the president or the executive power somehow to build up a military power and basically start enforcing whatever laws he decides, and maybe even take out Congress or something like that. So a lot of the Anti-Federalists says this large national government invites a dictatorship to eventually take control. Because no one national government can actually rule over a large area effectively. Does that make sense? That's a big time argument. And this was convincing a lot of people to vote against the Constitution. And the votes are going to start happening pretty quickly in the spring of 1788. So just about 4, 5, 6 months after the Constitution is publicized, people and legislatures are going to start voting on it. Madison and his friends like Hamilton and John Jay write a series of newspaper articles that get published all over the country. These eventually become known as the Federalist Papers. And the 10th article is probably the most famous in general. It's called the Federalist Number 10, which is one of the optional readings. At its basic core, it says that there are two threats to democracy and the republic, the equality under the law. Number one is instability, kind of anarchy. So you have the extreme kind of liberal interpretation of no one's following the law, everyone's doing what they want, the kind of state of nature that John Locke talked about. And in the other extreme, you have a far too powerful government, a tyranny, a dictatorship. So Madison says those are the two extremes that we have to worry about in governments. He says instability is solved by creating a central government that has the power to rule over all the territory. So that's how you avoid chaos. Create a government, allow them to write laws, and enforce them. Just as John Locke basically said, and the other Enlightenment guys said in their ideas on politics and the creation of the first governments. He says tyranny, on the other hand, is overcome when you have a whole lot of different kinds of people in the country. So he says a large territory is actually good to avoid dictatorship. So he calls this the variety of interests. In a large country, you'll have a lot of different kinds of people. You will have people way down south in like Georgia, New Orleans, or something like that, who have economic interests and social interests that they believe in. And you'll have people far away up in Boston who have their own economic ideas about what should be done. And he says that the tyranny can be avoided when you have a whole lot of these different cities and different communities. When you have a whole lot of them, no one is likely to rise up against the rest and take control. So this is his general theory. A large nation has many smaller areas, smaller regions, smaller population centers. And each of those have their own economic interests, their own political ideologies, their own social demands. And when you have, say, 20 or 30 different cities, areas, it is unlikely that any one will rise up and take out the rest. Because each of them have, again, their own independent ideas. And this is similar to the balance of power we talked about in Europe, remember? The idea that no one government, no one society should rise up and be more powerful than all the rest, because then they'll push everyone else around. When one group starts getting more powerful than everyone else, what happens? What do the rest do? Anyone remember? What happens when one kid on the block gets stronger than everyone else and starts pushing all the other kids around? What do those kids do often? Yeah, they gang up on him. They take him out to remove the threat to all of them. And so Madison is using this political idea that's been around in Europe for a long time by this point. And he's applying it to the United States democracy. A variety of interests, a whole bunch of them spread throughout the country, will cancel each other out. So that no one group can rise to prominence without being kind of smacked back down by the rest. Therefore, it is unlikely that a tyranny will rise from just one area and dominate the rest, because the rest will complain and the rest will start to take action. So he calls this the variety of interests. And it's a major kind of foundational theory in the United States government today. Is that still in place? Is that still in power today? I would say debatable. Because you have two dominant parties that get, 98% of the vote or something like that. But each party has a lot of different little groups, right, within it. And any candidate that wants to run for, National Congress or the presidency, they have to get the acceptance of all these different kinds of little groups to get nominated. So oftentimes what we see today is this variety of interest down in the primary level where parties are choosing their candidates. So today, not so much in the general elections that we're going to have in a month or so. All right, and here's the map of the voting results in different states and the order that different states accept the Constitution in 1788. Generally, the smaller states voted to ratify the Constitution very quickly. You see Delaware is first, who's second? Oh, Pennsylvania's second. That's a little bit difference. New Jersey, Connecticut's fifth. Generally, the small states voted very quickly to accept the Constitution because they saw, at least if they get state equality in the Senate, that that's good enough, that will protect their power. So they're very accepting of the Constitution generally. Georgia is fourth. They voted to accept the Constitution because they wanted a powerful national government to raise an army and go off into these western areas and defend Georgia, its land claims against the Spanish and the natives. So they want a powerful national government to defend, literally, Georgia lands claims. Let's see, who else is in here? Connecticut's fifth. Let's see. Massachusetts is sixth. They take a vote in the state legislature that is very close. 187 to accept the Constitution and something like 168 against it. So out of somewhere around 340 votes or so, only 20 make the difference. So it's a very close thing in Massachusetts. New Hampshire's another small state. Maryland's a small state. South Carolina likes the defense of slavery. Hampshire again, small. Virginia and New York are really the big holdouts. Remember, once you get to 9, the government goes into effect. So who's 9? Where is it? Oh, it's New Hampshire. Okay. So once New Hampshire votes to accept it, the national government will go into existence. Virginia and New York are probably the two most important states, them and Massachusetts. Because Virginia has a gigantic population. That's where people like Washington and Jefferson were from. And New York had a giant economy, New York City. New York only votes to accept the Constitution when Hamilton leads a group of New York businessmen to demand, if the state legislature in New York State did not accept the Constitution, that New York City would break away and form its own state. So again, the secession argument rises up. And that largely carried the argument, and New York State ratified the Constitution. So they go in. Virginia only accepts it when people like Washington and James Wilson and James Madison personally put their reputations behind the Constitution. And you have a couple long-term holdouts, like Rhode Island doesn't come in for a while, that they don't even join the Constitution until the next year when the national government, Congress, has already started meeting and passing laws.